So thank you, Jen, for being here. As we were talking before, informal institutions are very important in Guatemala and in other countries around the world. But I want to know, from your perspective, what makes an informal arrangement robust in comparison to state arrangements or government discussions or decisions?
So economists like to talk about something called the IKEA effect. And I don't know if you're familiar with the store IKEA. Do you have it in Guatemala?
No, we don't have one. But
People here probably know what IKEA is. It's a Swedish furniture store, and you go there, and it's like a big warehouse. And you look at the catalog. We have a lot of them in the United States, one in Pittsburgh, and it's very easy to look at the furniture. It's very inexpensive, and some of it can be very stylish. And I look at catalogs, and I point, and I tell my husband, "Oh, let's go get that." And then I go to IKEA, and I bring back home like these
1,000 stuff.
It's like, I have to put this together. Yes. So, but you have at IKEA, you put the furniture together yourself. And there's been this research that shows that when you put the furniture together yourself, even though it didn't cost a lot of money, maybe it's really worn out and maybe it's now out of style and very, not even working very properly, people don't want to get rid of it. The IKEA effect means that people really preserve the things that they create. And when you put your labor into creating something, you're less likely to want to get rid of it. And I think that is one of the really important things to recognize about informal institutions, right? These are the informal rules that different organizations use. And when people are creating the rules themselves, they value them, right? And because they, not always. There's some really negative informal institutions, right, that people may want to get rid of. But on the positive, the productive informal institutions, people create these things, and they're not done by themselves. They're social institutions, so they're created with other people.
They're imposed.
Right, rather than being imposed. And so an informal institution often requires the agreement of other people to participate, or involves the conscious creation by individuals and communities. Not always. There's some very long-standing informal institutions, social norms, some of them that come from culture, that are exogenous to the state. Some are endogenous to the state. So we want to be careful as we describe them and not romanticize them, but often they are enduring because people create them. And they do that in a social manner. So I agree and you agree, we did this together, and then it's not when a new law comes or a new policy comes or a new institution is imposed, and then it contradicts a pre-existing situation, pre-existing cooperation, for example, then people be hesitant to let go of what they've created themselves.
And do you think tradition has a role in it? Like traditional authorities or even tradition within a community without having an authority?
Absolutely. So those long-standing informal institutions are very, very precious to societies. And they, there's been a lot of research looking at the efficiency. Some people, have said, let's look at some of these long-standing practices and history to see why do they endure? They endure because some underlying efficiency arrangement. Which could be the case, but they also could be very deeply legitimate to people and have meaning. And I think that's one of the things that we don't do enough work on in the social sciences, is really studying meaning and the joy people get, right, from working together with other people. And now as our societies are entering this kind of period of isolation, we're seeing this across the world. I hope that we remember that there's some value in people creating things themselves.
And I feel like when in social sciences, when we talk about institutions, we usually talk about the rules of the game, like the framework around the organizations. So how do you think the structure of the organization has an effect on the capacity of a local authority or a local organization to provide services or anything for the community?
So I think we typically see two kinds of organizations, self-organized systems. We see those that are very hierarchically arranged, and we see those that are very egalitarian. And this is especially true of customary governance arrangements or traditional authority. There was a very famous Muslim thinker from the Middle Ages, Ibn Khaldun, who wrote about this particular issue. And he talked about the differences between egalitarian tribal structures and hierarchical tribal structures. And when you have an egalitarian system, it usually means, one person doesn't have the right to rule over others, which yields a lot of consensus, can yield a lot of consensus. The consensus, those processes by which you achieve consensus can take a long time. But once people do achieve a consensus, then you have a set of rules that are hard to break, right? And that's where it becomes very hard to impose external rules on communities that have these very strong egalitarian community or tribal structures. When you have hierarchical systems, you're far less worried about, leaders of them are far less worried about achieving consensus. They actually have the ability to organize large groups of people very quickly, and they can scale up very quickly. An egalitarian system, you go beyond a certain village or a certain community or a certain sub-tribe, forget about it. But hierarchical systems can nest. Right? So you can have tribes and sub-tribes and sub-sub-tribes. And one really important analogy or example of this I like to draw on was the recent U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. government used the same tribal strategy in both countries, but had very different outcomes. And that was because in Iraq, the tribal structure is extremely hierarchical. So when the U.S. tried this, it was very effective in mobilizing the Iraqi people against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and different Islamist movements that were opposing the United States. Or those same generals, like General Petraeus, who's very famous, and he came to Afghanistan, tried the same thing, and it failed miserably. And that's because the underlying tribal structure in Afghanistan is far more egalitarian. And I remember reading the New York Times with these maps of the tribal structure in Afghanistan, which made it look like there was this hierarchy, right? Yes, there's a large tribe and then there's sub-tribes. That structure is real, but when you look at it like a nested tree, a family tree, it looks like the person at the top can command everyone at the bottom. In an egalitarian system, that's not true. So, Afghans, for example, famously say, no Afghan can tell another Afghan what to do. When you're trying to fight an insurgency and mobilize large numbers of people, it becomes very hard. And to me, people fail to look at this internal governance issue of tradition or custom or the informal arrangements. You have the same word, tribe, a tribe in Iraq and a tribe in Afghanistan, but they're organized in very, very different ways. And when you don't open up that black box and understand the kind of organizational structure, then you shouldn't be surprised when you get the outcome that we saw.
Yeah, and you were saying that if the structure is egalitarian, it's harder to impose like an outside order. But do you think the state can still co-opt both types of organization, and how would that have an effect on the informal arrangements that
That's a really good question. I think in the cases where you do see hierarchical organizations, the state often does try to co-opt the leaders. Right? Because you do have actually identified leaders. When you have egalitarian systems, it's actually much more difficult to say who is a leader, right? I remember in Afghanistan, the U.S. came and said, okay, we're looking for the tribal leaders, just like they had in Afghanistan, just like they had in Iraq. And then everyone raises their hand, and then the U.S. pays all of them, right? And then the U.S. thought it was working with tribal leaders. There was no such thing, which makes it much harder to co-opt. Right? Which creates often very difficult zero-sum tensions and governance challenges. And I don't think states have really learned to grapple effectively in societies that have very, very strong egalitarian tribal structures. So when I share with you the names of Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, these are some of the places that have very robust Sudan, customary tribal structures that are egalitarian in nature, not hierarchical. The hierarchical ones are much easier to co-opt, and then you tend to see states work with them for better or worse.
Yeah, I think that would explain a lot about those failed interventions, as you said before. And we'll talk a little bit more about those failed interventions and the role of international aid in those countries in the next section. But thank you, Jen, for being here.